Hi, I'm David String with the Washington Family Rights Coalition. This is the fourth of 12 sessions at the FTC workshop on July 9th, 2025. In this session, we hear from a panel of attorneys, doctors, and scientists, including one who was threatened with 10 years in jail for blowing the whistle on illegal and secret gender mutilation surgeries. This is an important panel for understanding the criminal nature of the trans drug cult.
All right, everyone, welcome back. Please have a seat. It is time now for our first panel, the politicization of science. And I'd like to introduce our moderator and attorney advisor to Chairman Ferguson here at the Federal Trade Commission, Annie Chang.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Annie Chang, and I'm a current attorney advisor to Chairman Ferguson. We've already heard firsthand this morning the accounts of the harms due to what some refer to as gender-affirming care by those truly on the front lines, the parents and the survivors. We've also heard from Dr. Miriam Grossman pull back the curtain for us on some of the deceptive language, fraudulent medical records, and misrepresentations in letters used to support the medical and surgical procedures that amount to this type of so-called care. Though we're speaking publicly about these things today, we should keep in mind how impossible this type of event felt not too long ago. For much of recent history, even asking the questions we are posing today was in many circles totally forbidden. I hope by now you're thinking to yourself about the elephant in the room, how? And in my mind, there's two versions of how. First, and possibly most obvious, how did politics and ideology creep into and ultimately capture this area of medicine? And second, how, given the overwhelming success of that political and ideological capture, are we discussing these questions today? Before we discuss those questions and hear from our panelists who will shed light, I have the honor of introducing our four panelists, Edmund LaCour, Dr. Etienne Heim, Jordan Campbell, and Lior Sapir. And I'll just give a short biography of each. Edmund LaCour is the current Solicitor General of Alabama. In that role, he oversees the state's appellate and constitutional litigation. He has argued 3 times before the U.S. Supreme Court and dozens of times before other courts. Before joining the Alabama Attorney General's office, Edmund was a partner at the D.C. office of Kirkland & Ellis, where he represented numerous clients before the Supreme Court, courts of appeals, and trial courts. Before joining Kirkland, he practiced at Bancroft PLLC in Washington, D.C., and Baker Botts LLP in Houston, Texas. Upon graduating from law school, Edmund clerked for the Honorable William H. Pryor, Jr. of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. Edmund earned his bachelor's degree from Birmingham Southern College, his Master of Philosophy from Trinity College, Dublin, and his JD from Yale Law School. Dr. Etienne Heim is a general and trauma surgeon in a small town outside of Dallas. He attended University of South Florida for his undergraduate degree, followed by Florida Atlantic University Schmidt College of Medicine, where he was part of the prestigious Alpha Omega Alpha and Gold Humanism Honor Societies. He completed his residency in general surgery at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas in June 2023. During his residency, Dr. Heim was an anonymous whistleblower in a May 2023 story released by Christopher Rufo that showed Texas Children's Hospital had been lying about shutting down their transgender program. Instead of shutting down the year before, like they said, TCH continued and expanded the program behind closed doors. The very next day, the Texas Senate passed SB 14, a bill to outlaw pediatric gender intervention, which received bipartisan support in part due to Dr. Heim's anonymous whistleblowing. The Biden administration, however, had a very different response to Dr. Heim's bravery, which we will discuss during this panel, and which I'm sure many of you know. Dr. Heim lives with his wife and baby daughter in a small town outside of Dallas, Texas. Jordan Campbell is the newly appointed Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Consumer Protection Branch of the Civil Division at the Department of Justice. Before accepting that position, Mr. Campbell co-founded the first and only law firm exclusively dedicated to representing detransitioners and victims of radical gender ideology based out of Dallas, Texas. In that capacity, he represented plaintiffs across the country, consulted with state legislatures on proposed legislation regulating pediatric gender medicalization, coordinated with the state attorneys general's offices, and consulted on policy. He earned his bachelor's degree from Washington and Lee University and GED from Southern Methodist University. He will soon be moving his wife and 7 children from Dallas to join him here in DC. And finally, Lior Sapir. Lior Sapir is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He holds a PhD in political science from Boston College and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Program on Constitutional Government at Harvard University. Since joining the Manhattan Institute, Lior has become a widely recognized thought leader on topics related to pediatric gender medicine, education policy, and culture. Lior has offered incisive analysis of the institutional dynamics at play in youth gender medicine, the lack of incentives for evidence-based practices in this area, and the growing divergence between the US and other countries in medical policy. So I'm really excited today to learn from this group of speakers' experience on this panel's topic, and I want to start with Lior. So you've been writing and studying in this space for years now, and you've been ringing the alarm on the ways that politics have crept into medicine. As just one example, as early as 2022, you published an article on the, quote, affirm or suicide mantra that you described had become the central strategy of contemporary transgender activism, the empirical basis of which you explained is shoddy at best. So I'd like to hear from your perspective, from a 30,000-foot view, very generally, how did ideology and politics creep into medicine?
Thank you, Annie. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I want to thank the FTC for organizing this event, a very important event. Before I answer your question, Annie, I do just want to say one thing in light of the context in which this event is being held, and that is that there's growing awareness and acknowledgement, among professional class, liberal professional class people, that something has gone very wrong in the field of gender medicine. That there is this child-led model where no assessment takes place and kids are rushed into transition. So that's a good thing that that acknowledgement exists. The problem is that that acknowledgement is always accompanied by another claim, which is that there is an alternative, a careful way to do youth gender medicine. They sometimes call it the assessment model. And so I just want to make a few very brief comments about that because I think this is where we're going to see a lot of the kind of battle of ideas over the next couple of years. So the first thing I want to say is that even this supposedly more conservative approach to youth gender medicine has been evaluated in systematic reviews of evidence and has been found to be based on very low quality, meaning very uncertain evidence. Number two, as the Cass review, I think very helpfully pointed out, even a diagnosis of gender dysphoria is not predictive of adult outcomes. So if, even if you have a therapist who does a very careful assessment, there's nothing really that that assessment can tell you about what would happen to that child if they were not medicalized. And then the third problem is, even if there was good evidence for some mental health benefits in some kids, and even if a gender dysphoria diagnosis was predictive, which it isn't, it would still run into significant ethical problems involving informed consent, because no 12-year-old can really understand what it means to give up fertility, sexual function, to endure cognitive impairment, if that is indeed one of the consequences of pubertal suppression. So I just want to flag here that we are moving towards a debate about the careful assessment-based model, which itself has significant problems attached to it. Okay, so with that aside, to get to your question, this is obviously a long and complicated story, but at the heart of it, I want to argue is a broken chain of trust. So the previous panels, I think, explored this idea that medical professionals are misleading patients, misleading parents, and that's true. But I think that another crucial part of this story is that some folks in the medical community are misleading their colleagues. And that has to be accounted for. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen this, how many times I've heard this in my conversations with doctors, with people in positions of authority within the medical field, who for understandable reasons say, this is not my area of expertise. There are these other people that I call my colleagues who work at my hospital, and they are gender clinicians. This is their specialty. They know what they're doing. I don't want anybody to question what I'm doing. I focus on my particular area of expertise, and I expect them to defer to me, so I'm going to defer to them. And modern medicine cannot work without a high level of trust and deference, because modern medicine involves high levels of specialization and compartmentalization. And so that kind of deference is to be expected, and it's a good thing generally. But it also means that the medical profession, the trust that makes modern medicine possible can be abused. And pediatric gender medicine is a prime example of what happens when that trust is abused. It is a classic example of a broken chain of trust. So the leading authority on gender medicine in the United States is, of course, WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. WPATH publishes a document called the Standards of Care, which are essentially clinical recommendations. The 8th and most recent Standards of Care were published in 2022, and WPATH has managed to embed its standards of care and more broadly its approach to understanding human nature, sex, gender identity, and so forth in virtually every relevant aspect of US healthcare. So state Medicaid authorities and commercial insurers incorporate WPATH standards of care in their determinations of covered benefits. Hospitals conduct WPATH-aligned trainings, also called the Global Education Institute, and operate specialized pediatric gender clinics that rely or claim to rely on WPATH standards. Major US hospitals and medical schools integrate WPATH-aligned standards into their residency, fellowship, and continuing medical education programs. Around 20 medical associations, including the powerful American Medical Association, have repeatedly assured state and federal regulators that WPATH standards are credible and deserving of deference. And of course, the Biden administration, as we saw, cited WPATH standards of care in its policy memos and had its Department of Justice try to enforce those standards through litigation. In short, in the United States, gender medicine is WPATH, and WPATH is gender medicine. In a few minutes, you'll hear from my co-panelist, Solicitor General LaCour, about what his team found out about WPATH standards of care during the discovery phase of their litigation, Boe versus Marshall. Let me give a very brief overview. In evidence-based medicine, systematic reviews of the evidence are the gold standard for evaluating what is known about a medical practice. Clinical practice guidelines are considered trustworthy only if they are based on systematic reviews of evidence. WPATH's previous standards of care, version 7, which came out in 2012, was not an evidence-based guideline, and WPATH did not rely on systematic reviews of evidence for that guideline. When WPATH decided to revise its standards around 2017, it resolved to do so using systematic reviews. The co-chair of the 8th Standard of Care Revision Guideline, Dr. Asa Radix, said at the time that the 8th version would be, quote, the first to be developed using an evidence-based approach. So WPATH commissioned dozens of systematic reviews from evidence review experts at Johns Hopkins University. These included reviews of evidence for pediatric outcomes. But when WPATH leaders discovered that the evidence for pediatric transition was extremely weak, it prevented the Johns Hopkins team from publishing their results. WPATH claimed in the final guideline that a systematic review was not possible. It even told the authors of the adolescent chapter of SOC 8 that it was not possible to do a systematic review. WPATH violated other key requirements of trustworthy guideline development. For example, it failed to manage conflicts of interest, stacking the guideline panel with clinicians who were personally, professionally, and financially invested in medical transition. It eliminated age minimums for transition procedures for political reasons. And WPATH leaders privately admitted to including medical necessity statements for the purpose of insurance coverage and for winning legal battles. In short, WPATH put its activist agenda above any concern for patient health and well-being. And the Alabama documents provide incontrovertible evidence of fraud by the leading authority on transgender medicine in the United States. Now, the fraud WPATH committed, as I said, is not just against patients and their parents, who are the end users of WPATH standards of care, though that is, of course, their most troubling impact. It's also against the American public, which has absorbed WPATH's messaging about the safety and efficacy of these interventions through WPATH's allies in the media and in the medical profession. But it's also fraud, as I've been saying, against the rest of the medical community, including unsuspecting insurance companies, state Medicaid authorities, medical association leaders, hospitals, individual clinicians, including, I would suspect, some clinicians involved in gender medicine itself. Again, the broken chain of trust. But what about the other medical associations? We often hear that gender-affirming care is supported by most major medical associations. First, it's important to note that US medical groups that endorse the gender-affirming approach are at odds with medical authorities in places like Sweden, Finland, the UK, and Norway, hardly bastions of right-wing conservatism. In 2023, the director of Belgium's Center for Evidence-Based Medicine said, quote, "If we had to review the WPATH guidelines, we would actually toss them in the bin," adding that what WPATH recommends is, quote, "a pure experiment on children without any scientific evidence for it." Second, even in the United States, not all major, meaning large, medical associations support WPATH's approach. Last year, for example, the American Society of Plastic Surgeons effectively sided with the Cass Review, acknowledging the weakness of evidence for pediatric outcomes. Among those groups that do support WPATH's approach, the American Academy of Pediatrics, or AAP, has been one of the most vocal. In 2018, the AAP allowed a young medical resident by the name of Jason Rafferty to write its policy statement in support of gender transition for minors. The statement asserts that children have indisputable knowledge of their transgender identity and that parents and clinicians should follow their lead. It cites WPATH's standard of care, at that point it was the 7th edition, as authoritative. But as 2 peer-review articles in medical journals have shown, the AAP statement contains critical errors, including miscitations and misrepresentations of existing research. A systematic review of guideline quality from the UK, commissioned as part of the Cass Review, found that the AAP guideline is among the worst in the field. The problems with the statement were pointed out to Rafferty and the AAP soon after the statement was published, but the AAP has consistently refused to engage with or even acknowledge these criticisms, casting them instead as transphobic. Indeed, the AAP has gone to great lengths to silence its own members who have raised concerns about the organization's unwillingness to conduct or rely on systematic reviews of evidence. The AAP continues to insist to this day that gender transition for minors is evidence-based, safe, and effective. In a 2023 interview published in the Boston Globe, Jason Rafferty, the author of the AAP statement, said that gender-affirming care is about, quote, "affirming and validating the child's sense of identity from day one through the end." He explained that when a child declares a gender, quote, "we operate under the assumption that what they're telling us is their truth, that the child's sense of reality and feeling of who they are is the navigational beacon to sort of orient treatment around." In 2023, after a multi-year campaign from some of its pediatrician members who refused to be silenced, the AAP finally agreed to conduct a systematic review of evidence, even though by this point several such reviews had been published and the AAP could easily have relied on them. It's been 2 years and there is no indication that I'm aware of that the AAP has begun that review or that it intends to adhere to accepted standards of systematic reviews. So now let me turn to the Endocrine Society. In 2017, the Endocrine Society published a clinical practice guideline on gender medicine. Despite acknowledging the poor quality of evidence, the guideline makes strong recommendations in favor of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, a move that has drawn criticism from some of the world's leading experts in evidence-based medicine. The Endocrine Society explained its decision by invoking the, quote, "values and preferences," unquote, of pediatric patients wanting endocrine treatments. It said that it places a higher value on, quote, "avoiding an unsatisfactory physical outcome when secondary sex characteristics have become manifest and irreversible," unquote, than on, quote, "avoiding potential harm from early pubertal suppression." In other words, according to the Endocrine Society, helping a teenager achieve his or her cosmetic goals is more important than preventing harms from the use of off-label drugs. It's important to note that the clinicians who wrote the Endocrine Society's guidelines are themselves gender clinicians with conflicts of interest, and most were WPATH members. Now, a key element of WPATH's strategy has been what I've called credibility laundering. Medical associations with broader scope and larger memberships have specialized subcommittees dealing with LGBTQ issues, which today means primarily gender medicine. And these groups are WPATH aligned or even affiliated. For example, Dr. Erin Jansen of Lurie Children's Hospital is co-chair of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry's Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Issues Committee. Incidentally, he's also a WPATH member and co-author of WPATH's 8th Standard of Care. It's not just medical associations that produce a broken chain of trust. Medical journals are also responsible. We now have a large body of evidence demonstrating that medical journals have lowered or abandoned their editorial standards when publishing research purporting to show benefits from pediatric transition, and they also suppress or decline to publish critical commentaries on these studies. Leaders in the medical field may be forgiven for assuming that if a study reports improvement in mental health as a result of, say, cross-sex hormone therapy, that report is credible because it went through peer review. Again, the broken chain of trust. So to summarize, the medical transition of minors is a good example of medicine's failure to self-regulate. That failure is due not only to the broken chain of trust, which I've highlighted here, but also to the climate of intimidation activists have created within the medical field against any medical professional who would dare question gender medicine or its foundational concepts. As Dr. Hilary Cass wrote in her important report from last year, quote, "There are few other areas of healthcare where professionals are so afraid to openly discuss their views, where people are vilified on social media, and where name-calling echoes the worst bullying behavior. This must stop."
Thank you so much, Lior, for that very in-depth review of how we got here today. And speaking about kind of the broken trust in the medical field, we're really lucky to have Dr. Heim join us. I want to turn to you next. Your perspective on this panel is especially interesting, both because you are a medical doctor, you're a surgeon, and then also you have personal experiences kind of going up toe-to-toe with these ideological and political behemoths in medicine. I just kind of want to touch briefly, I know it's a long story, about your personal experience here.
Yeah, and thank you all so much for being here, and especially to the FTC for hosting us. But yeah, my name is Dr. Heim. I'm a general surgeon in a small town outside of Dallas. And I was the whistleblower who exposed that TCH was lying about the existence of their transgender program. And I'm sure that many of you are wondering, there's so much deception in this field. Where are the doctors? Like, why are there not other doctors who are speaking up? And all of this happened with me blowing the whistle during my training. And I saw it firsthand myself. There is a code of silence that exists among physicians in the profession today. If you break that code, then you will be targeted in the most vicious way possible. Because when I found out that the hospital I was working at, Texas Children's, which is one of the most amazing hospitals, in the country for taking care of kids, but they had this program that was harming these kids that had no basis in scientific or biological reality. They were doing this to children and they were lying about it. So I blew the whistle in May of 2023. There was a law passed the next day. More whistleblowers spoke out. Vanessa Sivich, who you'll hear about later today, and the hospital said that they were shutting down the program. But in response to that, I was targeted by the most powerful federal leviathan in human history. They tried to send me to prison for 10 years. I was charged with more felonies than some of our country's most prolific criminals. And this was for a crime that I had never committed, that the DOJ could never even define, where no patient had actually been harmed. They were using HIPAA as a basis for their indictment, even though the victims, they said, were the hospital and the doctors, not the patients, the hospital.
Thank you, Dr. Heim. And moving on, I kind of want to get more into your medical expertise. And you touched on this briefly about this code of silence. Why, in your view, has politics and ideology, how has that been allowed to stay in this type of medicine?
It's a decades-long process where the institution of medicine had been taken over by radical left-wing ideologies. And as that creep has taken a hold in these institutions, people who spoke up were increasingly vilified. So people would suffer the traumatic experiences of speaking out and then having their profession, their professional lives damaged. Either they would be fired, they would be held back from promotions, they would be sometimes targeted by governing medical authorities in their state. And in cases like mine, they would be targeted by the federal government. So you have real consequences to the doctors who speak out against this. And that is happening in conjunction with the professors at medical schools, the clinical doctors who are teaching medical students in residence. All of the people who are promoted, who are hired, are not the ones who hold conservative values, or not even conservative values, just like not radical values, right? Like being an average person essentially eliminates your ability from being hired in these prestigious academic centers.
I'd like to switch gears a little bit to the second question I posed at the top. We're talking about this cone of silence, how nobody's speaking up. So I want to really get into how we are here today. How are we here today asking these questions and having these discussions? I think we have a lot to thank to some of these panelists, including Dr. Heim. We also have a lot to thank to the work at the state level. We're the FTC, we're at the federal government level, but state legislators and state enforcement officers were willing to go to the mat on these disputes. We saw that in United States v. Skrmetti. So let's start with state enforcement. I'm sure it's at the top of all our minds, the Skrmetti Supreme Court decision that upheld Tennessee's Senate Bill 1, which bans healthcare providers from performing or offering to perform on a minor a medical procedure if the performance or administration of the procedure is for the purpose of enabling a minor to identify with or live as a purported identity inconsistent with the minor's sex under rational basis review. Many other states, including Alabama, however, also passed similar laws. Today, we're joined by General LaCour, who is at the forefront of that litigation in Alabama. General LaCour, can you briefly describe what you were seeing at the state level, particularly from Alabama, before all the litigation eventually culminated in Skrmetti?
Absolutely. Thank you, Annie, for having me here today. I think Alabama was seeing what a lot of states were seeing, which was a rapid rise in children identifying with gender dysphoria and a similarly rapid and unexplained rise in these clinics that were treating them with these untested treatments. So I think Arkansas was the first state to enact a law in 2021 setting age limits, then Alabama in 2022, Tennessee, other states the year after. And nearly every one of these laws was challenged almost immediately by the ACLU and other sort of activist groups. And they ran a similar playbook in every state. They would show up, demand immediate preliminary relief from the district court. They would have a carefully curated story, sort of along the lines of the assessment model that Lior was talking about a moment ago, and then they would appeal to WPATH. It was sort of their key weapon in their arsenal, which was these are evidence-based guidelines to provide medically necessary care to these children who are in deep distress. And judge, if you don't do something, they might kill themselves. And so many of these district court judges who knew nothing really about this were forced to make judgments very quickly, and in Alabama, as well as in other states, preliminary injunctions were entered that prevented us from enforcing our laws. In Alabama's case in particular, the district judge really relied on WPATH in his preliminary injunction order. But we saw that as a great opportunity because the WPATH guidelines had essentially been constitutionalized in the case. And we said, well, Judge, that makes them the most relevant thing for this litigation. And so we should get discovery into how these things were made. Were these the product of dispassionate science or impassioned advocacy? And what we revealed was really a political, medical, and legal scandal, like beyond what we had even imagined at the beginning of the litigation. As Lior referenced, I mean, the Biden administration was involved throughout the process in trying to craft these for the purposes of implementing federal policy. So there was this circularity there where the federal government was trying to alter the guidelines and then rely on the guidelines to alter federal policy. Most shockingly was, again, the instance where in 2022, after years of development, SOC 8, the version 8, was finally released on WPATH's website. And there were age limits in the guidelines for the hormone treatments and surgeries. Now, many would argue that they were too low, but there were still at least age limits there. And then all of a sudden, the guidelines disappeared from the website. and a new version came up like the next day that had no age limits whatsoever. And WPATH didn't explain why this was. Well, discovery revealed at least part of the reason why. It's that Admiral Levine, again, a senior HHS official at the time, had been given an embargoed final copy and then immediately began pressuring WPATH for political reasons to remove all age limits from the guidelines. And then AAP, who Leor referenced as well, joined the party in saying, we will come out against your guidelines if you don't abolish all the age limits on the surgeries and the hormones. And we have emails of WPATH authors going back and forth saying, well, should we really let US politics govern these international clinical guidelines? We feel bad about caving, but that caving is exactly what they did. And then we have emails saying, let's all get on message and fight misinformation, which they were putting out there into the public. As a result of that, there are some verifiable falsehoods in the guidelines that remain, again, on their website today. So WPATH says in the guidelines that all statements went through what's called the Delphi process, which Leor could probably explain far better than I could, but it's essentially a process where you consult different experts, try to reach a sort of consensus, and that consensus is its own sort of evidence. Dr. Coleman, who was the chair of the guidelines, said it's really the only evidence we have. But because Levine intervened at the end and said you need to change this statement and remove all the age limits, that process never went through, or that new statement that says no age limits needed did not go through the Delphi process. So that's a verified falsehood that's there in the guidelines. Leor referred to the conflicts of interest problem. WPATH claims that they followed the recommendations of the National Academies of Medicine for developing guidelines free from serious conflicts of interest. Again, we showed that that's not true. The National Academy says that only a minority of people involved in guideline development should be people who have some sort of interest in the procedures. But Dr. Coleman, under oath, in a deposition in Alabama's case, said that most people, so not a minority, but most, who were involved in SOC8 did have a financial or non-financial interest. Indeed, all 119 authors were members of WPATH, and Dr. Marcy Bowers, who also oversaw the guidelines development, said that in Bowers' view, it was important that every author for the guidelines be an advocate for expansive transgender care in WPATH's view. So again, we have guidelines now that are based on these undisclosed conflicts of interest, which raises serious problems. And I think that's how you get to a position where they can use the terms evidence-based and medically necessary in such a loose manner as to be almost meaningless. I mean, speaking about the evidence base, I mean, Leor already touched on a little bit how Dr. Robinson at Johns Hopkins had been contracted to do this systematic evidence review for WPATH to see, to look at all the evidence that might be out there and see if there's strong evidence, weak evidence, or no evidence backing up any of the recommendations. In 2020, Robinson was already able to confirm to HHS that there is, quote, little to no evidence when it comes to children and adolescents. HHS responded, it's good to know there's little to no evidence. And then years later, we're telling the Supreme Court that there was overwhelming evidence to support these treatments. And Leor already touched on how the evidence reviews were being suppressed by WPATH. In fact, they required final approval of any article that used any of the data. And anyone who's putting out an article based on the data had to, quote, use the data for the benefit of advancing transgender health in a positive manner, close quote. But I mean, the point of evidence-based medicine is to look at all the evidence that might be for or against your hypothesis, not to just pick the stuff that supports your view and leave the other stuff aside. So I mean, that bias undermines the entire process. But to make it appear neutral, WPATH imposed an additional requirement on their authors, saying that they needed to tell, in their manuscript, they needed to tell the world that they were, quote, solely responsible for the content of the manuscript, and the manuscript does not necessarily reflect the view of WPATH, close quote. I mean, that's very hard to square with WPATH having final approval of every manuscript. The last thing I'll touch on, medical necessity. as Leah referred to, the sort of the child-driven model. There are phrases like embodiment goals that show up in the emails that we received from WPATH. And I think those emails and even the guidelines themselves made clear that wants are being treated as needs in their view. And so as one author put it, it was in her view, quote, "Clear as a bell that the associate refers to the necessity of treatment in its broadest sense for gender dysphoria because it refers to the symptom of distress, which is a very, 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 it's three varies, broad category and one that any good-willing clinician can use for this purpose." And so when you redefine medical necessity in that light, you can get strange sentences like this in the guidelines. Quote, "A key challenge in adolescent transgender care is the quality of evidence evaluating the effectiveness of medically necessary gender-affirming medical and surgical treatments." But of course, if there's no good evidence out there, calling it medically necessary clearly puts the cart before the horse. But that's what we have in the guidelines today. And I promise, last thing here on medical necessity. SOC8, for the first time, has an entire chapter devoted to men who identify with a eunuch gender identity. SOC8's chairman admitted under oath that even though no diagnostic manual recognizes eunuch as a medical or psychiatric diagnosis, WPATH's official position is that castration may be medically necessary for a healthy man with no mental health conditions who presents as eunuch and wants to be castrated. So when the same guidelines say that it is medically necessary that middle schoolers like the ones we heard from earlier this morning with gender distress need to receive surgeries and hormones, one should ask, what does WPATH really mean by medically necessary?
Thank you so much, General LaCour. And you mentioned, you got all of this information during discovery, so I have two follow-ups on that. One, I read speculations online that obviously your case didn't make it up to the Supreme Court, Skrmetti did. I've heard online that the Biden administration chose not to petition for cert in the Alabama case because you received all of that discovery. Is it your sense that you were able to uncover that and they kind of wanted to keep that silent?
That was absolutely our view because after we got the documents, the same lawyers from the Department of Justice under President Biden were suing Alabama and were suing Tennessee. And Tennessee's case was going up on a very truncated, like 6-week record at the preliminary injunction stage. And they decided to seek cert, even though one reason for the Supreme Court not to take a case is because the record is small and underdeveloped. And the United States has argued against the court taking other cases on that very ground. Meanwhile, we'd been litigating for a year and a half. We had all this record we had developed. We were getting ready to go to trial. And just a few days after they asked the Supreme Court to take the Tennessee case, they actually filed a motion in the Alabama case to say, whoa, 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 like, I know we sued Alabama and we need relief really quickly, but let's just hold up on this litigation. Let's press pause, like they say with the puberty blockers, and just wait and see if maybe the Supreme Court's interested in taking Tennessee's case, because that could resolve a lot of things. And at that time, the discovery was still all under a protective order. Now, once documents that have been produced under protective order hit the docket as litigation documents, like through trial or through a summary judgment motion, the burden shifts to the party who wants the protective order to be enforced to explain why the public shouldn't see these documents. And so that's what I think they were trying to prevent from happening. Fortunately, we were successful in opposing that stay motion, and then another stay motion filed with SPLC. A few months after that, we got to file our summary judgment brief, and that included a lot of all this evidence that I've been talking about today, and that really helped to shift the narrative and sort of expose some of the scandal.
And so the Alabama case was stayed, and my second follow-up is, so that effectively ended when Skrmetti was granted at the Supreme Court. What did you do?
Well, it actually ended a month before Skrmetti. They came to us and said, we want to drop our case with prejudice, which means like we lose completely. Even before Skrmetti was decided, though, which we took as a sign that, like, if Skrmetti had gone their way, like, ours was the last case they would want to go forward as the next one up, because even if heightened scrutiny is applied, when you see that the guidelines they've staked their entire case on are based on this sort of advocacy and not science, like that would be sort of a terrible blow for them in terms of pushing this narrative. So they walked away a month before the Supreme Court even issued its decision.
And then you filed an amicus brief in this case.
Yes, so in October of last year, we filed an amicus brief in Scrimeti, laying all this out, really calling the United States to task for making their representations to the court when they knew what we knew, and explaining what we had uncovered about WPATH, which again had been cited multiple times by the private plaintiffs and by the United States in getting the court to take the case and in making their case at the court. That brief was cited extensively by Justice Thomas in his excellent concurrence, and so it was an honor to be able to do that work.
Thank you so much. I want to turn to private litigation in Jordan. Jordan is now serving in the federal government, but before that time, and I think some of you know here as former clients of his, you left your position as a partner at a boutique firm in Texas, where I'm sure you're doing quite well for yourself, at a firm that was dedicated to representing members of the D-trans community who have been harmed by what some have described as gender-affirming care. Before we go into your substantive work here, I just kind of want you to share what motivated you to go into opening up this firm that specialized only in this work?
Yeah, thank you, first of all, for having me. It's an honor to be on this panel, and when I say that, I mean truly, it's an honor to be with these three guys, because I have no right to be here. They're so much smarter than me. All I can really do is just kind of relay what I have learned from hearing from my clients and literally hundreds of others that we were unable to represent for statute of limitations reasons, which is a whole separate topic. But what my background was big law, commercial and antitrust litigation, and so it was a hard right career turn to go into gender litigation. And what got me there was essentially what we heard this morning, and it was just the stories and testimonies of folks I didn't know existed called detransitioners. And the more I read and the more I heard from them, hopefully, like others in here, I couldn't turn away and I couldn't do nothing. And I saw that there was really nobody that would stand up for them. There was nobody that would speak up for them. And there was certainly no lawyers that would represent them. And so I said, okay, well, I'll be one of those folks and I'll step up and I'll try to represent them the best I could. So it's not I didn't know a ton about the medicine. I've certainly learned from folks like Lior, who I've become good friends with. I've known Eddie for a long time and certainly learned a lot from their litigation. And by the way, for nerds who like to read amicus briefs, that is the best amicus brief I've ever read. You should absolutely read it. But it wasn't any of that. It was hearing from my clients, hearing from others, and just saying, yeah, I feel like I need to do something.
Thank you for that. So we heard a little bit from General LaCour about, litigation tactics that were used in state litigations to kind of keep this information out of the public view. I was wondering, in private litigation, you were litigating against, I'm sure, healthcare institutions, entities, medical practitioners, sometimes maybe governments. I was just wondering if there's any discovery that you uncovered or facts that you uncovered that you're able to share today, keeping in mind I know some of it is subject to protective order. Yeah,
I would just say there's certainly tactics at the practitioner level that we would see that were very common. I literally cannot tell y'all how many times I've heard folks, clients or potential clients we've interviewed tell us about the suicide myth that they were told, which is would you rather have a living son or dead daughter or vice versa. Very, very common tactic. The surgical letters, by the way, that Dr. Grossman highlighted for us this morning as well, very common tactic. And I would actually say those are some of the more detailed letters that you'll actually see. It's more common to see even more form letters that are even more fraudulent that just, in 2 quick paragraphs say, we even had one client who had a doctor sign a letter that said they can certify that this patient meets all the WPATH guidelines, which include months of, dysphoria, if not years, and the doctor said, I've been treating this patient since the day that they signed the letter. So, like the most blatant evidence of fraud of, I know this patient and I know they meet all the criteria and I just saw this patient today, but I'm going to sign off on it right here and check the boxes. So the letters are certainly a very, very common tactic. The suicide myth is a common tactic. And I would just say that generally speaking, the overall thing that just really blew my mind, the more we would dive into records, the more we'd see from these institutions, was just the absolute unquestioned rush to quote unquote affirmation with 0 guidelines. I cannot tell y'all how many patients we have spoken to where the absolute very first time they spoke to a clinician, they were prescribed cross-sex hormones or a puberty blocker or both. Which flies in the face of even the quote-unquote WPATH guidelines, which they all purport to follow, but in practice, none of them actually do, which that's the thing that really jumped out to me was they don't even play by the rules that they purport to follow.
So there's one last question I want to ask all of our panelists, and Lior touched on this briefly in the beginning. We're here today after Scrimeti, after this state enforcement action, after private individuals have, put their livelihood sometimes at stake to allow us to ask these questions and hear from people today about what's been happening. So what's next? What's next in undoing the view and the politicization and ideology that's crept into medicine?
If I can start it off, I think one of the best strategies, especially for Jordan Campbell moving forward, and anyone in the Department of Justice who has the capacity to enforce the law, is what Dr. Grossman showed us earlier. Me as a surgeon, if I used diagnosis codes that were that fraudulent, I would be in prison, right? That's a real crime, not like the fake crime that they charged me with. And all the Department of Justice has to do is enforce the law. These laws already exist. These people are committing crimes. If the investigations are done and the prosecutions are brought, then these people will be held accountable, and there's a very good chance this will stop even in blue states.
Working on it, Dr. Heim. Obviously, there's certainly a legal angle that I'm sure the FTC may be interested in. Obviously, the Department of Justice is interested in. But I would also say more broadly that it's a cultural issue, and it has been. I'd say the pendulum is swinging right now, and the reason for that is I just think that truth is actually now being brought to bear. That light is actually being shown on what is going on, and ultimately I would think that truth wins out. And so just as far as, what can we, how does this move forward? How do we progress in this area and recapture it? I think it's stuff, panels like this, where the actual, what is actually happening is being brought to light. I think ultimately that's what moves hearts and minds, and that's when people wake up to see this can't be right. And ultimately that's probably what changes things.
I would say, consistent with what I said earlier, I really do think both for intrinsic reasons and also for strategic reasons, we need to have understanding and grace for medical professionals, people in the mental health field who have trusted their colleagues for understandable reasons and have been misled. I think we need to, continue forward, pressing on with evidence-based medicine, continue insisting on the case for looking at evidence, thinking about the underlying clinical rationales, the concepts of transgender medicine, as Dr. Grossman very helpfully pointed out, but at the same time, having some understanding and trying to help create an off-ramp for medical and mental health professionals who have got caught up on this issue. I don't think it does us any favors to demonize Those who don't deserve to be demonized. And I especially think that we need to have understanding and compassion for the kids and their families who have crossed the Rubicon and who have medicalized and who have committed their lives to these procedures. We can't demonize parents above all. To me, that's always been my red line. Never demonize parents. Parents have been misled and lied to constantly. So we need to have understanding, and we need to help create off-ramps. That's what I would say.
And to sort of piggyback on something Jordan said, I think getting the word out is so critical. And one problem we faced early on was that some of the things that were being done were just so horrible that most people wouldn't believe it, right? Like, no, that can't be true. Like that, I mean, it's like this move, like surgeries aren't happening, and if they are, it's a good thing. But then you hear from the people who've been so damaged by it, and that can, I think, hopefully open people's minds up. But then also, I agree with Leor that there are some folks in the medical industry who've been tricked, and there are some who are doing the tricking. And for those who are in that latter group, I think it's going to be important to continue to investigate.
Let's give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you so much.